Socrates once asked Euthyphro a famous question. Is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's already good? Whichever way you try to answer, you are in trouble. This is where the divine command theory hits a wall. In Christianity, this is known as Euthyphro dilemma. However, Christianity has a very clear way out of this. In today's video, we are going to look at the answers the Christian theology provides. But before that, let's try to understand the problem a little deeper. This dilemma has two horns. So let's break down both sides. If something is good or bad just because God says so, then morality is not objective. That will be the end of objective morality. Think about it. If God were to say tomorrow, it's okay to murder, not a big deal, would murder suddenly stop being evil? If we go down that road, we are basically picturing God as an arbitrary lawgiver. Now, let's look at the flip side. What if we say God forbids something because it's inherently evil? That would mean there is a moral standard above God binding God himself. This is exactly why Euthyphro backed down without a real answer. Plato's dialogue doesn't actually give a solution. It ends in what we call aporia, a total dead end or an unsolved puzzle. Now, how does Christian theology fix this? First, we have to realize that not all moral laws are the same. The first category is absolute morals. These are rooted in the very nature of God. Take, for example, do not kill, tell the truth, love others. These laws never changes. For instance, when Cain killed Abel, it wasn't wrong simply because God had previously issued a command saying, do not kill. Whether that specific command existed or not, the act was still inherently wrong. This is what we call intrinsic evil. You don't need a specific law to know that these things are wrong. These are laws written in the human heart. For instance, a murderer knows that he is doing wrong. A liar knows that he is lying. And those who cheat know that their actions are wrong. Acts like murder or betrayals are intrinsic evils because they contradict God's holy nature. That's why they are evil all the time. God would never command these things. In fact, He can't. Because it contradicts His own nature. God simply cannot act against who He is. Now, the problem with saying that morals are absolute in the Euthyphro dilemma was the implication that a higher moral standard must exist above God, binding God Himself. But in Christian theology, God Himself is that moral standard. Intrinsic evil is simply anything that doesn't align with God's holiness. These are what we call absolute morals. They are based on God's character and they never ever change. In Christian theology, God is not just a lawmaker who picks rules. God's own unchanging nature is the standard of goodness itself. Moral rights are reflections of His own character, and wrongs are deviations from it. But not all moral laws are absolute. Some are actually changeable. Think of these as rules given at a specific time or under certain circumstances to lead humanity towards ultimate morality. While these rules might change as situations evolve, the moral goal behind them stays the same. We call these positive laws. These laws exist because God commanded them. So, while some laws are rooted in God's holiness and His unchanging nature, making them unchangeable, others are commands God gave specifically for human welfare. In short, some things are forbidden just because they are inherently wrong and contradict God's holy nature. And other things are wrong because God commanded against them. Next, we need to understand the role God has given to humans in lawmaking process. God has actually delegated authority to us to create the positive laws necessary for social order and peace. We call this delegated authority. This is a major point of departure between Christian and Islamic theology. In Islamic theology, Allah is the sole legislator. Humans don't have independent authority to make laws. Human authority is strictly confined within the boundaries of Sharia. But in Christian view, humans act as partners with God in building the legal framework for society. This theological difference completely changes how we approach democracy. This is exactly why a democratic system, where the power to make laws rests with the people, aligns so well with the Christian values. On the other hand, an Islamic legal framework that believes legislative authority belongs to God alone finds it difficult to fully reconcile with the core principle of democracy. Islam is fundamentally incompatible with democracy. In short, the difference between democracy and theocracy really comes down to whether or not we recognize this human partnership in lawmaking. It's from this perspective that we should evaluate how Christian theology solves the Euthyphro dilemma. The answer to Socrates' Euthyphro dilemma is actually quite simple. Goodness is in the rule that exists outside of God, nor is it something God just changes on a whim. Instead, it is God's own unchanging nature. Realizing that God isn't just a lawmaker, but the very source of goodness itself, gives us a worldview that respects human reason and freedom. That's why balancing God's sovereignty with our democratic responsibilities is not a contradiction. It's a natural extension of Christian convictions.